Tu-144 versus Concorde, the presentation that became a tragedy before 250,000 witnesses. Paris, 1973. Paris, 1973, the height of the Cold War. A massive crowd gathers at Le Bourget Airport to witness what promised to be the battle of the century in the skies. On one side, the Concorde, elegant, refined, the technological jewel of the West. On the other, the Tupolev Tu-144, the Soviet supersonic jet that the world nicknamed Concordski. The stage was set for a historic confrontation. But what the audience witnessed that day was not a triumph. It was a disaster transmitted before 250,000 people, one of the most shocking and mysterious accidents in aviation history. Before takeoff, Commander Mikhail Kozlov, confident, reportedly said a phrase that today sounds like an omen. "Just wait until you see us fly, then you'll see something. Sit back, here comes the story." The context: a divided world aviation greetings. How are you all doing? While the planet lived divided between capitalism and socialism, Brazil was experiencing the height of the so-called economic miracle, commanded by General Emilio Garrastazu Medici. The country displayed growth above 10% per year, but at the cost of censorship and political repression. On the radios played Sampa by Caetano Veloso, hard concrete poetry of your street corners, and I Just Want to Put My Block on the Street by Sergio Sampaio, songs that discreetly challenged the regime. On the other side of the world, the technological race was fierce. After sending Yuri Gagarin to space, the Soviet Union needed to show it could also dominate the commercial skies. The message was simple. If the West created the Concorde, the East would create something even faster and show it to everyone at the greatest aeronautical event on Earth, the Paris Air Show of 1973. The Tu-144, Soviet ambition personified. The Tu-144 was the personification of Soviet ambition. It was designed by the Tupolev Design Bureau under direct directive from Nikita Khrushchev to surpass the West by any means necessary. The aircraft was developed at a frenetic pace. In just 5 years, it completed its first flight on December 31, 1968, becoming the first commercial aircraft in history to exceed Mach 2, twice the speed of sound. Meanwhile, the Concorde followed its own path, refined, somewhat quieter, exhaustively tested jointly by the British and French. The Soviet jet, in contrast, was heavier, loud as hell, and thirsty for fuel. To maintain supersonic speed, the four Kolesov NK-144 engines needed continuous afterburning, which made the aircraft drink kerosene like a V8 Maverick. The Tupolev's cabin was deafening. Reports indicate 90 to 95 decibels. That's a rock concert. Passengers communicated by notes, not by voice, because they couldn't hear each other. Even so, the Concordski had charisma. It displayed small retractable wings at the front, the famous canards, which helped with lift at low speeds. It was a bold, advanced aircraft, yet unstable, reflecting the political haste that gave it birth. The lesson before the story. You know, in aviation and in our lives, those who stop learning fall behind. In 1973, the Soviets and Westerners were racing for the world's fastest aircraft. Today, the race is for who learns better and faster. The fatal flight, June 3, 1973. At 3:19 p.m. on June 3rd, the Tu-144 took off from runway 3 at Le Bourget. In command, Mikhail Kozlov, one of Tupolev's most respected test pilots. Beside him, co-pilot Valery Molchanov and 4 flight engineers. The flight plan called for an 11-minute sequence, identical to what they had done the day before without problems. But there, before the world on that special day, something changed. Kozlov completed the entire routine from the previous day, and when he was approaching for landing, he pushed the throttles to maximum. The engines roared in full afterburner. The Tu-144 began an almost vertical climb, reaching 4,000 feet, 1,200 meters of altitude. The crowd applauded, ecstatic, but in seconds, the sky transformed into a nightmare. The disaster. The aircraft leveled off and dove violently at an angle of nearly 38 degrees. The pilots tried to regain control. The canards were re-extended, but the G-force multiplied to between 4 and 5 Gs. The structure couldn't withstand it. The left wing broke off, and the Soviet supersonic jet disintegrated in the air before hundreds of thousands of people. The wreckage fell on the small town of Goussainville, just 6.5 kilometers from the airport. 15 houses were destroyed. The 6 crew members and 8 more people on the ground, including 3 children, did not survive. 60 people were injured. The roar of the engines gave way to a funeral silence. What should have been the symbol of Soviet pride transformed into a worldwide tragedy. The investigation, politics, and shadows. While the world tried to understand what had happened, Brazilian newspapers reported the disaster with astonishment. Here, we were living through a period of euphoria with the expansion of commercial aviation. Varig was opening new international routes, and Brazil was beginning to dream of its own aeronautical industry, led by a young company, Embraer, which had been founded just 4 years earlier, in 1969. This Paris accident was seen in Brazil as a warning. Not even superpowers were immune to political haste and the risks of technological vanity. But what really happened inside the Tu-144's cockpit? Was it human error, espionage, or an engineering failure that doomed the aircraft in full flight? When the wreckage of the Tu-144 was still burning in the suburbs of Goussainville, a new race began, the race for answers. But this would be an investigation marked by shadows, silences, and politics. The accident happened at the height of the Cold War, and it quickly became clear that discovering the truth would be as difficult as crossing the Iron Curtain. On one side, French engineers from the DTCE and Aerospatiale. On the other, a Soviet committee led by the Tupolev Design Bureau itself. Both worked side by side but with completely different agendas. The official report and theories. The joint Franco-Soviet report was published 8 months after the disaster, in February 1974, and the result was vague. The document stated that no abnormalities had been found in the aircraft's design, and that the crew had deviated from the approved flight profile, attributing the accident to human factors. But the official final cause was marked as unidentified. This bureaucratic and imprecise answer convinced almost no one. It was as if the accident had been filed away under the weight of politics, and as always happens when the truth is suppressed, theories begin to emerge. Theory 1, the French Mirage. The most popular version at the time said that the Tu-144 tried to avoid a collision with a Mirage 3 fighter jet. The Mirage was indeed in the air at that moment. A reconnaissance aircraft, Mirage 3R, sent by Dassault to photograph the Soviet supersonic jet in flight. But the problem is that the Tu-144 crew had not been informed of this fighter's presence. According to this theory, the Mirage came too close and surprised Kozlov, who reacted instinctively with an abrupt, evasive maneuver. The dive would have been an attempt to avoid a mid-air impact. Decades later, this hypothesis was partially confirmed. The Mirage was really there, equipped with cameras and flying at low distance, but its direct role in the accident was never proven. And there was a detail that weakened this theory. The canards, the Tu-144's small front wings that were supposedly the target of the photos, were already visible on the ground before the flight. In other words, there was nothing to spy on in mid-air. So the Mirage explanation seemed plausible but didn't make technical sense. Theory 2, the falling camera. Another version emerged from within the Soviet circle itself. One of the engineers on board, Vladimir Benderov, was carrying a TV camera to record the exhibition. According to this hypothesis, the camera came loose during the maneuver and blocked Commander Kozlov's control column. But physical calculations debunk this idea. During the descent, the aircraft experienced negative G-forces, which would make any loose object float upward and backward, not fall onto the controls. The camera, therefore, could not have caused the aircraft's dive. Even so, this simple, almost cinematic theory remained for years as an unofficial official explanation in Soviet backstage circles. Theory 3, the real villain. Now, the most convincing analysis came much later and was published in a Russian memoir book called The Truth About Supersonic Passenger Aircraft. The author was an engineer involved in the Tu-144 program itself. This version details a design flaw that transformed the pilot's maneuver into an inevitable trap. The Tu-144 used in Paris was equipped with an experimental automatic stabilization system. something like a primitive autopilot. This system was controlled by a panel of 20 selector switches behind the co-pilot's seat. During flight preparations, 2 switches were activated, one for lateral stabilization, X, and another accidentally for longitudinal stabilization, XB. This second switch should never have been turned on. It was an experimental control channel, without filters and without certification, and it was activated by mistake. While the canards were extended, the XB system remained inactive, like an engaged safety brake. But when the canards retracted, this channel was released, the fatal sequence. When Kozlov reached the top of the climb, he retracted the canards. The brake was released, and the defective channel went into action. The system sent an immediate command to the elevons, the wing's control surfaces, and they moved 10 degrees downward. It was as if the aircraft had received an automatic order to dive immediately. When Kozlov perceived this sudden pitch down, he reacted. He pulled the control column, trying to recover the aircraft, but the XB system interfered and nullified the pilot's command. In a last reflex, the commander ordered the canards to be re-extended. When the canards opened, the XB was deactivated. Remember, it only activated with the canards closed, but this also caused the elevons, which were abruptly pointing downward, to be completely moved upward, because that's what was happening with the control column. The pilots were pulling. The aerodynamic force changed direction instantaneously. The result was a structural overload estimated between 4.5 and 5 G-forces. The left wing, not yet reinforced and never tested for complete static loads, simply broke off. The Tu-144 entered an inverted rotation. The fuel ignited, and the aircraft disintegrated at 280 meters altitude, at about 350 knots, 650 km/h. The engines, according to investigators, continued functioning until the moment of rupture, ruling out any hypothesis of propulsion failure. The aftermath. The Goussainville disaster left 14 fatalities, 6 crew members and 8 people on the ground, and 60 injured, many with severe burns. But beyond the lives lost, the accident destroyed something symbolic, the aura of Soviet technological invincibility. Within the Soviet delegation at Le Bourget, the climate was one of mourning and embarrassment. The disaster happened on the stage of the expected victory, before the international press, and quickly transformed into a political wound. The Soviets ended their participation in the event, collected the wreckage, and withdrew any public access to the investigation, imposing total silence. The Western press, especially the French and British, reacted with bewilderment. Le Monde called the episode the tragedy that made the Paris sky cry. Meanwhile, Soviet newspapers like Pravda and Izvestia treated the accident as an isolated incident, never mentioning technical failures. The Franco-Soviet Commission, even in possession of this technical data, never published it officially. The report delivered in 1974 maintained the same tone. No abnormalities were found in the design. The crew deviated from the flight profile. Cause, unidentified. But internally, the Tupolev Design Bureau recognized the error. Subsequent versions of the Tu-144 received modifications to the stabilization system, limiting the 11 deflection from 10 degrees to just 5 degrees, and structural reinforcements to the wings were implemented before the next tests. But nothing would erase that trauma from Paris. The disaster exposed not just a technical failure, but a symptom of the political haste that guided the program. It was the price of wanting to prove technological superiority before guaranteeing safety. The Tu-144's commercial life and final fall. But even shaken, the Tu-144 program was not immediately cancelled. The political pressure was too great to admit failure. 4 years later, on November 1, 1977, the Soviet supersonic jet finally entered commercial operation on a weekly route between Moscow and Almaty in Kazakhstan. The Tu-144S model, still equipped with NK-144 engines that needed continuous afterburning. The flight was so loud, expensive, and uncomfortable that it's unclear who flew on it, because in reality it was a political symbol. Tickets cost 68 rubles, more expensive than a common flight, but even so, tickets became scarce quickly. Everyone wanted to fly on the supersonic jet, but there was a detail. The aircraft didn't belong to Aeroflot, they belonged to the Ministry of Aviation Industry, despite being painted as Aeroflot, and the flights were operated by joint crews. Clear evidence that the aircraft was still experimental and not a mature product for civil transport. Then we move forward to 1978. Tupolev engineers presented an improved version, the Tu-144D, equipped with Kolesov RD-3651A engines, theoretically more economical, but the promise of efficiency didn't withstand reality. The engines presented chronic problems, vibrations, compressor disc failures, and extremely low service life. After just 50 hours, maintenance was already needed. And then the worst repeated itself. On May 23, 1978, during a pre-delivery test flight, the Tu-144D with registration CCCP 7711 suffered an in-flight fire caused by fuel leakage due to a fatigue fracture in a fuel system tube. Fatigue in a brand new aircraft. The crew noticed a discrepancy of almost 5 tons of fuel, but didn't pay much attention because those gauges were always malfunctioning, and they didn't believe them. When they tried to start the APU, the leaked fuel ignited. The aircraft managed an emergency landing, but 2 flight engineers did not survive the fire. This was the final blow. The Tu-144 would never again transport passengers. The end of an era. Shortly after the 1978 accident, all flights were suspended, and the Ministry of Civil Aviation began openly pushing for the program's termination. On June 1, 1983, the Soviet government signed the official decree for the definitive cancellation of the Tu-144 program. The aircraft that once symbolized national pride was relegated to hangars and museums, transformed into a research laboratory. But ironically, it would have an unexpected second life. In the 1990s, in the post-Soviet era, one of the last Tu-144s was reconfigured to serve as a supersonic testbed in cooperation with NASA. Dubbed the Tu-144LL, it was used for aerodynamic and noise tests with the objective of studying the behavior of aircraft at Mach 2 and new materials in wing configurations. So for some time, the Concorde cut through the skies again, now not as a symbol of rivalry, but as a symbol of scientific collaboration. The same aircraft that had fallen victim to ideological haste was ironically transformed into an instrument of cooperation between former Cold War rivals. Pretty cool. I liked that story. Conclusion. Triumph and tragedy. The story of the Tu-144 is, at the same time, a triumph and a tragedy. A triumph for having taken Soviet engineering to its limits, and a tragedy because the same impulse that launched it to the skies was what destroyed it. The obsession with beating the West at any cost led to the collapse of an idea that national pride can replace the time needed for technological maturation. The Paris sky in 1973 witnessed not just the end of an aircraft, but the beginning of the end of an era. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you value this work of telling stories that have made and continue to make a difference in aviation safety, your support means everything. This is a story of ambition, engineering, and the human cost of rushing progress in the name of pride. Until the next flight.